kind of field testing some material for a book I've been trying to write, which has been interrupted on a great many occasions, called The Effective Preacher. When I was a young preacher and I was a teenage preacher, I wanted to be a great preacher. And I knew what a great preacher was. I had seen many of them. I saw them in the conventions. I saw the kind of churches that they built. I grew up, as many of you all did, in a very insulated and isolated world of the African American church. I'm a native of St. Louis, Missouri. I'm a third-generation Baptist pastor. I saw men build numerically great churches simply on their preaching gifts. That is a world that has eclipsed. Growing up in that world, I had a definition of what I thought a great preacher was. In the almost 40 years that I have been preaching, I've come to understand that the real goal is to be an effective preacher. And one of the keys to our effectiveness is to learn to preach for results, not just for response. And so that's what I want to talk about. And I hope that we certainly will have time to dialogue, maybe not with the same enthusiasm as we did on the sexual dynamics of preaching. It wasn't particularly part of my presentation. One thing that I cannot pretend to do is to approach the act of preaching in a simply academic fashion. Neither can I approach it antiseptically or in the abstract. I have devoted almost 4 decades of my life to its practice, and I have sought to excel in its proficiency. In the first decade of the 21st century, we are caught in the tension between a utopian and dystopian view of preaching. The Bible itself contributes to this dichotomy. A utopian view of preaching proclaims preaching as the panacea for the ills of the body of Christ and the iniquities of the human family. The Apostle Paul proclaims that the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. The rallying cry of the utopian view is just preach, and everything will be all right. But then there's another view. There's a dystopian view that reminds us, and Paul also speaks to this, that as he looked prophetically at our time, he brought into focus a church comprised of believers who will not endure, and the NIV says, put up with sound doctrine. The Old Testament narrative warns of a spiritual famine, not of food or a thirst for water, but a famine of hearing the words of the Lord in Amos 8:11. The vision of Ezekiel in the valley of the dead dry bones in Ezekiel 37 begs the real question, does preaching still work? Can these bones live? Brothers and sisters, preaching has fallen on hard times. It suffers from far too many craftsmen who do not respect the craft or care to excel in it. Some of the dismal practice we see in contemporary pulpits is the result of poor preparation, both natural and spiritual, a lack of call, a lack of gifts, and preachers who do not prize the privilege of preaching. Preaching is facing something else today. It is facing an unprecedented resistance, a lack of appreciation, disinterest, and a disconnect from those who hear it.
Yes, indeed.
Our churches are full of people who listen to us preach, but rarely do they hear us.
Oh, God.
Our churches are full of people who are religious window shoppers. They're looking, but they're not buying. Proclaiming the good news is the initial and primary act, but that proclamation must be heard. The Apostle Paul asked a similar question in Romans 10:14. How can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? The act of hearing is so essential that in Romans 10:17 it says that hearing is the ignition switch for faith. How many times we quote, faith comes by hearing.